This will be the second part of our two-part lecture on the weaknesses of the budget in achieving an equitable distribution of income. So we talked about in the first part limitations of direct taxes, weaknesses of direct welfare benefits, and the weaknesses in indirect taxes. In part 2, we'll look at the other 4 limitations. Look at number 1, we'll look at the limitations of indirect benefits. So indirect benefits being community services provided by the government to those needy. 2, we'll look at how equity can conflict with other government goals or government objectives. 3, how there are also financial constraints to the achievement of equity. And lastly, we'll look at how long time lags may undermine effectiveness. So long time lags undermining fiscal efficacy or effectiveness. Okay, we're going to start off with limitations of indirect benefits. So we know that indirect benefits involve the provision of community services. So we're just going to note this as services provided to the community. So these services include public health, public transport, public education, and so on. However, in recent years, what the government has started to implement was this idea of a user pay principle. So what this means is that there has been a trend towards applying this principle where those who want to use these benefits have to actually pay for them. So this would actually cost the cost of service or cause the cost of services to increase, and therefore those who genuinely need these services such as health, housing, transport, education would then suffer as a result. So this user pay principle here would then undermine or decrease the final incomes of those in the lower quintile or quintiles. So we talked about how income distribution can be separated into 5 quintiles, the lower quintile being the poorest and the upper quintile, or the 5th quintile, being the highest or the richest, especially if the government implements this user pay principle to these indirect benefits. Because of lower revenue and because of greater expenses, then they would have to implement this user pay principle, which would undermine the final incomes of those in the lower quintile. So those who are less financially well off would experience a decrease in their final incomes and therefore cause a movement away from the achievement of an equitable distribution of income. Okay, so that's the first limitation to the budget. Secondly, we're going to look at how equity can conflict with other government goals. So again, we'll focus on this equity versus efficiency argument. So people will start getting complacent if people start living off welfare payments. So this idea of the welfare trap again comes to the fore. So if people start living off the welfare trap, this would undermine greatly our efficiency in resource allocation and therefore cause even higher levels of unemployment. So we're going to note the goals that this actually undermines. So full employment. So as people move towards this welfare trap, there will be even greater rates of unemployment, economic growth, because of this decrease in the labor force, and also productivity. So all these will not be achieved. I'm going to put 3 crosses there because of these 3 goals not being achieved. And again, when the government puts out more, gives out more welfare payments, then because of this low levels of unemployment, because people are starting to live off welfare, then that would mean they would have lower levels of taxation revenue, and so to fund for the extra welfare they would have to borrow overseas, which may also compromise our position overseas related to this goal of external stability. So equity can conflict with other government goals, especially full employment, economic growth, and this idea of external stability and low productivity. Thirdly, we have what is known as, or the weakness of, financial constraints. And so this would limit the number of funds available because of this overriding acceptance that the government has to achieve this fiscal balance over the medium term. So this would mean that the government does not have the capacity to pay out welfare payments if they have run a few budget deficits in a row, and they require a budget surplus in order to achieve this fiscal balance in the medium term. And so that is another weakness of the budget in achieving an equitable distribution of income, because the government wouldn't have unlimited sources of cash. And so what this means is that sometimes they don't have enough money to pay out reasonable welfare payments so that they could live above the poverty line. So as they try to achieve this generally accepted view of fiscal balance as a guide for positive budgetary policy implementations, this would actually limit the availability of welfare and the provision of services given decrease in funds, or a limit in funds available, I should say. So a decrease, or in fact a limited amount of funds available. So that's another constraint of budgetary policy, is that they don't have unlimited sources of money to achieve this equitable distribution of income. And lastly, we have long time lags that may result in an undermining of policy effectiveness. So for example, the government has tried to decrease reliance on welfare payments after people have retired, so post-retirement, by implementing this superannuation or superannuation charge. So as people work, their employers are required to pay a certain proportion of their income as superannuation to fund their retirement. And this is around 9% at the moment. And slowly the government has tried to increase this to 12%, so that once people retire, they have less need to actually rely on the government to fund for their retirement. However, as we know that this policy implementation has an end goal or end target of around 2019. This is 9 years after its implementation. So we can say that those people who retire between these years will not actually receive 12% of their income contributed to their post-retirement superannuation fund. And so this is a very pertinent example that shows how there are also long time lags between the implementation of the policy and the actual impact of the policy on this savings or long-term savings of workers. So as we can see, that sometimes when fiscal policy uses discretionary stabilizers in order to increase savings rate or increase superannuation so that they can fund for post-retirement economic activity by workers, it would not actually work immediately, but it would take some time before it actually impacts on the economy. And so in the meantime, those people who retire between 2010 and 2019 would actually have to rely on government welfare payments again if they haven't saved enough in their superannuation fund. Okay, so they're the four remaining weaknesses of budgetary policy in its goal of achieving an equitable distribution of income. So to recap, we have limitations of indirect benefits and equity, how equity can conflict with other government goals, notably full employment, economic growth, productivity, and external stability. Thirdly, we have financial constraints of the budget, so that they can't have unlimited, they don't have unlimited funds, and they can't pay unlimited welfare benefits to people. And fourthly, we have long time lags which undermine fiscal efficacy, especially this new superannuation guarantee charge, which is predicted to take 9 years in order for the impact to be fully felt throughout the economy.